because I think it's natural that we find ways to best support children. I think it's natural to find ways to engage children in meaningful and purposeful activity, even if it means that we have to remind them from time to time using visual supports to see that they stay on task and they do things. And that would be in seeing that they're involved in independent self-care or a variety of different activities, recreational activities. We can use them to do many, many kinds of things. And I'm going to touch on many of those kinds of things today. Now, using these schedules, particularly now when families are home, may be a lifesaver and a lifeboat for many families, because it's going to provide structure and routine that's been ripped away from families. It's going to provide opportunities for learning that the children no longer have access to, or at least if they do, they're asked to sit in front of screens and engage with these two-dimensional persons who can't engage with them in any meaningful ways. So we're going to talk about what you can do at home to help your youngsters stay on task, to be engaged in purposeful, meaningful activity. And so you can worry less about the lack of structure, which for many families now means that children are maybe melting down more, they're having more behavioral problems because of all that's been pulled away. So that's what I want to talk about today. So we're going to this is a proactive approach, and I should say that the use of the schedules is to learn how to do this is quite involved. So basically, I'm going to paint this picture of what's possible, and over subsequent meetings, I'm going to talk about some of the particulars that need to be in place and how we can get some of those in place. I'll provide some models of what's possible, what you can think about when we put these in place. And again, talk about some of the particulars that have been, and there are resources available. I'll point you to some resources that will also guide you when you're ready to start doing this. But there are many things that we want to talk about before you can probably think about putting these things in place. So I guess what I want to say is this is not easy to do. And while families are now confronted with the challenges of having families at home, I know saying this may not sit well with you initially, but let me explain. This may be an opportunity, because you wouldn't have an opportunity to be with your home with your child for as many hours as you are now. And it may be an opportunity for you to learn how to do things that you may not have otherwise been able to do. And this is a conversation I think we want to have with Jerry and Jackie in terms of how we can help you structure those things and access resources to do that. So maybe, if you don't mind, I'm saying this may be an opportunity. Okay, so let's start. I want to sort of walk you through some of the kinds of things that we can do when we're talking about schedule building. And one of the advantages, or many of the advantages of using schedules is that it allows us to start to introduce not only predictability and structure, but we can build in choice. We can build in opportunities for children to learn to negotiate, to make initiations. It will help us allow us to address aspects of executive function. So where we're asking children where the demands on children to remember things for longer periods of time, to hold things in mind for longer periods of time while they go about doing what they need to do. So that the schedules support children in their ability to hold things in mind for longer periods of time. So not only do they have to respond immediately to instructions, which is what we often see in ABA, like what's your name, what color is it? It's like go to, so the picture may be a reminder to go make a sandwich, so that they have to then go to the kitchen and follow a number of steps to do that. And we can structure things so that children can learn to move through time, hold things in mind, and do things for across time. It will help with organizational skills. It also is a tool that we can use to teach flexibility, to teach children to learn to be more flexible, so that changes come up all the time, and we have to help children adjust to those kinds of changes. We can teach children to help and participate more in family routines and activity, even to where we might even ask children to learn to do chores. These are all the kinds of things that we can think about when we think about building independent activity schedules for children. And I hope it's clear in the way I'm talking about this. These are not static. This is not something that you set up one time and then the child is always expected to do the same thing. We have a lot of control. The child has a lot of control over what they can, the kinds of things they'll be able to do in their schedule. And I'll show you how we can start to help children make choices within the schedules themselves. And I'm going to be talking about this, but mostly in rudimentary ways. But like I said, there's a very flexible and robust system itself. And I hope that after our discussion today, you'll have a clear sense of what's possible. I guess I wanna articulate again, it's not easy to get this in place. And the demands on people's time and material demands are, particularly up front, are greater than just sitting a youngster in front of a screen. You're going or just throwing children into the natural environment where there are no material demands. There are very few demands on parents' time. In the beginning, this will require more time for parents because there's a lot of teaching involved. But once the schedule is in place, you as a parent can go do what you have to do because you know your child is engaged productively in something. So those are some of the benefits of having these schedules in place. As I said earlier, and we'll talk about this in subsequent meetings, you can't expect that you're going to build the schedule and expect your child to follow it. There's a lot of learning that needs to take place before. And I'll talk about what some of those things are. So some of the prerequisites of abilities, the most rudimentary things that we need to have in place is that children are good at matching things 2D, so they can match picture to picture, they can match picture to object and the like. And I'll give examples of how that's used in the schedule. And later we'll talk about how to get those things in place before you put those matching tasks in place in the schedule. So let me get started. Let me just give you some examples of what this looks like. And for a good resource, let me just step back again. There's a book that's been around for many years, probably, well, maybe 25 years. It was written by McClanahan and Krantz. And I think I have the title here. I'll go back to it if I don't. It's called Activity Schedules for Children with Autism, Teaching Independent Behavior. It's a remarkable guide, and I'll touch on some of what they've done and what they recommend for getting these things in place. I'll touch on that later. But first, I just want to show you what this starts to look like, okay? So in general, when we start, the way I like to start is by having a binder. We have binders like this. Can you all see this? I hope. And in the binder, we have things that will cue the youngster to get some materials, or in other cases to do things. So I'll show you, we'll talk about not all the kinds of things, some possible things that you can think about. So in this case, and you're gonna have to excuse my back, so we have a little orange dot here. So when children are working with their schedules, again, in the beginning, they're going to take this little dot and they're going to match it to a corresponding item, which is sitting behind me. So again, excuse my back. So here all they have to do is go find this thing that they're going to use. In this case, it's a matching book. And I'm sorry, let me get this set up a little bit. So it's very simple to use, but you can see the demands on building this material will take some time. So we have some pictures, we have a binder, and the child goes to retrieve their binder so they can do, and again, remember, this is a very rudimentary ability. We're going to talk about more sophisticated kinds of things that we can have in mind. But this is something that most children can do, certainly very young children can learn to do, and children like doing it. So they have their binder, and this is the way we've set it up. There are other ways of setting it up. And they have this picture. And what do they have to do? They have to learn to open their binder and then go search for the match. Learn to turn the pages and then scan the pages until they find their match. So this is a nice little exercise. And as you can see, while it addresses matching ability, you can see it also addresses a variety of other abilities that and strengthens other abilities that children will need to have. So they have to stay on task for longer periods of time. And the deeper the match is in the book, the more time the children have to pay attention to what they're doing and remember what it is that they have to do. So some of these tasks will layer in other demands. So this is a task that requires memory. It requires matching. It requires scanning, right? So it's a nice little task, and it's a very simple little exercise. So what happens? They finish. Now what? We have to teach the child to put this away. And they go back to their original binder. And what you can imagine, what's next? What's next? There's another task. Oh, and look, it's another dot. So what's on this dot? You get the idea. So now we can put things in bins. And when they bring the bin over, there'll be another activity. This activity is actually a block building exercise. It's another matching activity. So there's a model. The child goes to their bin and builds to the model. Now you can imagine this is going to take some time for children to learn that when they see this, that they build what they see. So this is an imitation activity. And this takes time to get children prepared to be able to do this so that they can go and do this independently. Make sense? Okay. So this is just one other kind of activity. Now, this is an imitation activity. There are a variety of other kinds of things that we can teach children to do and that we've done with children over time, and they've had a great time doing it. We've built exercise videos for children. So we make a video and children will go to their binder and they'll see a picture of the computer, or we can use textual prompts as well. Go do your exercises, and we can stretch the amount of time that children have to do their exercise videos. And we make these, again, the demands on our time up front in sort of building these materials is considerable because we have to make the video. And then we have to teach children in very systematic ways. This is what we're talking about when we're talking about very often when we're talking about ABA, is that we have to break things down into smaller pieces so that children can learn to do things in bite-sized chunks, and then we will construct things so that more time is required, more abilities are required. So in the beginning, maybe if you're familiar with ABA, what we call ABA, there's some very basic imitation exercises where we say things like do this or do this, and then we can move to two-step, do this and do this. Now, eventually that moves, the ability to imitate things moves to imitating block structures, imitating activities that others are engaged in, like exercise videos. So children are able to sort of follow an exercise video, or to learn to do dance moves. We've had children learn to imitate to make by watching YouTube eventually, so they learn to make paper airplanes. So there's a real, the purpose in teaching some of these rudimentary abilities is not simply that children learn to touch their nose when someone does this. But it's to put in place the ability, the rudimentary abilities of imitation, so that children learn to do what others are doing, so that they can obviously do many other things that will be presented to them as imitative activities. So again, I'm just giving you a basic idea of what you can do very early on, but it can be enlarged in very interesting ways for kids. I'll give you a few other ideas of the kinds of things that we can put in schedules. Let me see what I have here. And again, these matching tasks are very rudimentary ways of building your schedules. So we can use these kinds of simple dots to make the matches. I don't remember. Oh, so, and what we often do is once we can get children to learn to do worksheets, we put worksheets in there. And so this again is a matching task. The worksheet itself is a matching task, but it builds in the ability to use a writing tool so that children learn to make the matches using magic markers. And these can be reused, and we can put 5 in here, we can put 10 in here, and they can all vary. But again, the hard part is getting all this ready for inclusion in the schedule. But if we're talking about matching, going back to what we said earlier about imitation, we don't teach matching for matching's sake. You can see this is a matching task. This is a matching task. The block building is a matching task and an imitation task. So all these things that we teach when we're talking about ABA, it's not just that these things go into some maintenance binder and they say, oh, we've mastered imitation because he can touch his nose when I touch his nose. No, it's a building block. It's a starting point so that you can build from there all the other kinds of things that involve imitation, all the other kinds of things that involve matching, all the other kinds of things that would eventually involve writing. So we get the rudiments in place. We don't let it just sit in a book and say we've mastered it. We build from there. We construct much more sophisticated abilities, more advanced and complex abilities from the rudiments. That's the beauty of the ABA. Building from the rudiments, constructing more complex abilities. So far, so good? Makes sense? Okay. So again, because my interest is in activity schedules, I really wanted to give you some more ideas of the kinds of things you do. I said earlier, you can build choice in. So here's an example of how we do that. We'll put 2 items on a page. And the child, when they're doing their activity schedule, can select which one they want to do. I want to play on the trampoline. So they put that down and they go to their trampoline. And of course, the question is, how do they know, or how do you know that they're going to use it properly? How do you know that they're going to stay on there? They're not going to stay on there indefinitely. Well, we teach children to use timers. So we have those on our phones now. In the old days, we had to have these timers, and we used to put the timers in our books. But now it's much simpler. We have timers on our phones. We teach children to match. Oh, look, matching again. Ha! What do you know? Match this, enter this in their phone. When it goes off, what do? They come back to their schedule. So you can have 4 or 5 things on here so that children can decide what they want to do at any given time. Again, building in choice so children aren't frustrated. They're being asked to do things that they don't want to do. We want to always build in as much choice as we can. In the beginning, you're not going to be thinking about as much choice, but also eventually, children are going to have the control over what they put in their schedules. So today, these are the kinds of things I want to do. First, I want to do this, and then I'm going to do this, and they start putting their schedules together. The other thing I talked about was, and I didn't talk about, but I'm going to mention it anyway, because it's important. We can use these schedules to build concepts, because what falls out of the use of schedules are concepts like time constructs. So we can start to say, what did you do before you used the trampoline? Or what are you going to do after you did your coloring? And how many activities did you do today? Or how many pictures did you paint today? And they don't have to hold that in mind necessarily, because they can always go back and check. Oh, I see, I remember, I did that before I did that. So this is a platform that we can use to get concepts in place, and then eventually children will start to hopefully learn what it means when we say, what did you do before? That means, oh, the activity that I did prior to this, and they can check. So it's a nice tool for getting concepts in place as well. It's a nice tool for advancing some of the rudimentary abilities that children have acquired. And it's a nice tool for introducing choice, using teaching children to use other tools like timers. Other choices, we can teach children to go to their phones, and if they have favorite songs, they can go listen to their favorite songs or videos. I want to listen to Itsy Bitsy today, and I'm going to put it on my timer. So these are all the kinds of things that we can think about. We can teach children, once they recognize, once we've taught up what it means to set a table, we can teach children to go set a table and help with the household chores, or to take the trash out, or to sort the laundry, or to help mommy or daddy in other ways. These are some of the things to think about. Now, I have a few other examples here. Now, I don't know if you see this, but up here we have, it's an American penny, but it's a token. So we can also teach children to reinforce themselves in schedules. So if you're concerned that they're not going to be able to sustain their attention over time for long periods of time, there's several things to consider when doing that. You can have children reinforcing themselves. And so you can have a token board on the front, or you can have a separate token board. So when they complete 5 activities, they can choose an activity to do, or they can get a snack, or they can find somebody to do something with. So you can build in reinforcement that way, or you can also build the reinforcement right into the schedule. So you make sure that you embed in the schedule fun activities. So those activities might be like the trampoline, or listening to a favorite song, or watching a favorite video. That's probably the best way to go. But if children really like using a token economy, you can use that as well. This is a very versatile tool, extremely versatile. So with that said, a lot of these schedules can be used in the beginning. When you consider using schedules, you're going to limit the amount of time that we're going to expect children to do things. So maybe, certainly in the beginning, you're going to teach children, you're going to systematically build up their ability to follow their schedules. But eventually, particularly now that you're home, we want children engaged productively for longer periods of time. Now, when kids were in school, what we used to do, they used to come to our center, and they'd spend 6 hours a day at our center. But then what happened when they went home? They couldn't just go home and sit on the floor, because that was often the proclivity. Those are the choices that children often used to make. I'm just going to sit around. Now, for some families, they're relieved that their children are just sitting around and taking care of themselves and not getting into trouble. But some families would prefer to see their children are actively engaged in productive activity when they get home as well, and would continue using the abilities and the skills that they learned at school, but without parents always needing to sort of remind them to what to do, to stay on their back to see that they're on task. So that's why the schedules are so nice. So when children come home, we used to have in their schedule things like go hang up your coat. And we used to do this in our center as well. So then they came in, they would look at their schedules, and they would have things that they had to do. Put their lunch box in the refrigerator. When they come home, to empty their lunchbox, to clean their lunchbox. or to make a snack. So here we have, again, a choice. So do you want to have a sandwich? Do you want to have a bowl of cereal, or do you want to have popcorn? Now, what's interesting here is that, again, the versatility of these schedules. So say a child makes the choice they want some cereal. Now that's a pretty complicated thing to do. Or making a sandwich is a pretty complicated thing to do. Or making popcorn is a pretty complicated thing to do. So in the beginning, what we can do is we can embed schedules in schedules. So they do this. You see there's a little yellow indicator on here. I happen to have the red bin, but then they have to go get another binder, which will direct them in that task. So if the task is to make a sandwich, so I haven't made this binder, but then you would have reminders of the sequence. So the chain would be get some bread, or go to the refrigerator, pull out the bread, pull out the mayonnaise, pull out the mustard, whatever those things that you would like. You make your sandwich, and then the schedule would follow from that. When you finish, clean your dishes, and then there'd be another picture to remind them to go back to their original schedule. So you can have schedules in schedules. Now, I also want to emphasize that our hope is eventually that the picture itself will set that whole chain in motion, so that you don't need all these other binders with all these other steps in there, so that it would just be the picture of the cereal bowl, which would remind children of everything that they have to do. It would be the stimulus to say, okay, I have to get the bowl, I have to get the milk, I have to pour my cereal, I have to clean up, and then I have to come back and check my schedule. So there's so many things that we can do, and there's so much teaching involved to get children ready to do this. And there are many things that we can do to fade out all of those steps, those reminder steps, so that it's a little tighter and manageable. What else can we do? We can teach children to make choices in terms of activities that they prefer. So there are two choices they have to make on here. There are choices in terms of who they're going to play with. I'm going to play with Sally, and we're going to play Chutes and Ladders. So what does this assume? And what would this require? Well, obviously it would require that youngsters then go find somebody, the person they choose, and to go find the activity they're going to play. So that may be on a shelf in another room. These two, if they decide, and they could even choose to play with both youngsters. I'm going to go with Johnny and Sally. So here we were talking about executive function abilities, remember, when we started. So here what has to happen is I'm going to find Sally and Johnny, and I have to go to the kitchen to find them, or I have to go to the living room to find them. And I have to go, or wherever it is, I have to search. I have to remember, I have to keep in mind who I'm looking for. And then when I find them, I'm going to have to do something. What am I going to have to do? I'm going to have to make some kind of an initiation, right? So we can build in all these kinds of language demands and language requirements within these schedules as well. So that we might go up to Sally and Johnny. And again, if it's Sally and Johnny, the demands on our attention and memory are greater. And we're going to have to, the children are going to have to learn to say, hey, do you want to play Chutes and Ladders? And hopefully that person's going to say yes. And if not, then we can also at the same time start teaching children to negotiate. So the schedule sort of is a framework or a platform where we can get all these abilities sort of working at the same time. So now we can work on initiations, we can work on negotiations, we can work on choice, we can work on executive function, where children have to remember for longer periods of time what they have to do to keep things in mind for longer periods of time as they travel. And there are many steps, of course, as I said before, there are many things that we want to have in place before we get to this point. But these are the kinds of things that ultimately we can have in place so that children are engaged productively, socially, academically, if they're academic tasks, and can be engaged in other kinds of play activities that they enjoy. So these are just a few things, and there's no limit to the number of things that you can put in here. And there's no limit to the kinds of expectations that you can build in. So it's not the static system, and it's remarkably robust. So I love schedules. I think they're phenomenal. As I said before, a lot of people would be opposed to them because they're, quote, not natural. But I think it's very natural that children learn to make choices. I think it's very natural that we support children in ways that they may not otherwise engage in productive activity, or for those children who have a hard time remembering what to do for long periods of time rather than just one thing at a time, and to do things immediately. We can stretch this out over the course of a day, as I said. So that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about independent activity schedules. You can find out more from McClanahan and Krantz in terms of some of the mechanics that we want to have in place to get these things in place. And I want to touch on those for a minute. As I said earlier, a lot of this teaching requires enormous human resources. There needs to be someone there to teach this. And when we're teaching these kinds of activities, what Krantz and McClanahan will suggest, and I think it's a beautiful system for teaching children to do this, is we use basic tools to get children to learn to follow their schedules. So there's something called full manual guidance. And when we're doing this, we're usually working from behind. So the child's sitting at their desk, the adult is behind them, guiding them hand over hand to open the page, to pull whatever the thing is off to make the match in the beginning, to bring their bin over, and then to complete the activity. And all the while providing the necessary reinforcement to see that children are engaged and that they're being rewarded for doing this. It's very time consuming, but the rewards are phenomenal. How to sort of do all this on your own is really the biggest challenge. What are all the steps, all the things that need to be done to teach children to do this, and how do we even get children to learn to match before you get them into the schedule is part of the problem here. And this is, I'm going to introduce things in subsequent talks about ways that you can start to learn to engage children in learning, some of the rudimentary skills that children will need to have, as I said before, to be able to do these things and many other things, of course. So we'll talk basically about how do we get children to first pay attention to us? How do we make sure that children are engaged and satisfied and enjoying learning? How do we sustain their attention during learning? And what are some of those rudimentary abilities that we need to think about? So we'll be thinking about matching. We'll be thinking about imitation. We'll thinking about basic one-step instruction and maybe two-step instruction. And how do we get all these things in place? I want to step back a little bit. And I want to talk about the current situation that many families face. Now, the situation for many families, both in the United States, where services are readily available to families, which are no longer available, and to families in most other places in the world where there are very few services available, is reminiscent of what was in place when I started this, which was probably close to 30 years ago. When I started this, there was no one around. There were very few services available to families in those days. There were a handful of providers, primarily in those days. There were probably 2 or 3 organizations that were providing support to families. And what were families doing in those days? Well, they had the professionals coming in to assist them, but who was providing the care in those days? Who was actually teaching it? Who were the people who were actually involved in the implementation? And the answer to that is quite simple. It was parents very often. Unfortunately, it was often mothers. But there were some families where fathers were also involved, but someone was usually working. Now, a lot of people are at home, so maybe you can get both parents involved. But we'd also recruit teenage children if they were available. We would ask families to recruit neighbors and friends. So, as I said earlier, this may be an opportunity that wouldn't have been available if people weren't home, because it harkens back to a time when families had to be resourceful because there were no professionals around in those days when I was starting. And it sounds like, in speaking with Jackie and Jerry, there are very few professionals available where you are. And I don't know if I'm speaking to people only in Kenya or not, but it may be a time to rally and think about how to recruit family members, how to recruit neighbors. Families would tap high school students or college students who needed a little extra money. And in those days, I need to emphasize again, it wasn't expensive to do this. Because it wasn't a profession. The only people who were doing this were the people like myself and the people who were teaching me. There were only a handful of us doing this. So it wasn't expensive to do it. And I don't know what the situation is in Kenya, but it shouldn't be expensive if you're recruiting high schoolers. And it doesn't mean, and high school students can learn to teach children to do this. They just need someone who's able to teach them to teach. And that's really the question. Who's going to be available to teach the people who are going to be implementing this, whether it's a parent, a sibling, a high school student, or a young college student? Who can you tap to teach these people to teach your children? And that's the question that Jerry and Jackie and I have struggled with. And maybe that's a discussion that we can have in subsequent discussions, or even today, because I think I can probably wrap this up. I just wanted to sort of give you an idea of some of the kinds of things that can be done. And remember, this is something that's done after much of the learning has already taken place. So there's so much that needs to be in place before thinking about this. So anyway, I'd like to open up to questions. I think it's a good time. What do you think?
I think so too. One of the things that stands out, I guess, for me is that what you're talking about is actually adaptable irregardless. We use irregardless as a word in Kenya. I don't know even if it's the correct word, but it's something that can be used regardless of the age of the child.
Absolutely.
So it depends on the level of understanding of a child. And even if they are older but have not understood sequencing, we can start with the lower grade activities, batching activities, but the aim is to get them to be able to independently follow instructions when they are adults or when they begin a job. Because even in my day-to-day work, I have to follow a set of instructions.
Precisely. That's precisely right. We all have lists.
Yes.
We all have lists. I check my schedule every day. And
yes,
if I have to go to the supermarket, my wife makes sure I have a list that I have to get. Or I have to stop at before I go to the grocery store, I have to also stop at several other stores. I need my lists. All we're doing.
Okay.
Follow your list.
Okay.
Precisely. Thank you, Jackie.
So all we're doing right now is beginning something with our children or young adults, because I see There are some participants who have kids who are a bit older, teenagers. So it is really to begin to think about independence in adulthood and begin even with activities of home, activities of daily living, to begin to break down those tasks so that the child can then even be helpful in their home, and that can participate. If the other children within the home environment are doing activities, they also should be able to participate, because we've bothered to take a little bit of time and break down the tasks in a way that they can understand and follow, depending on their understanding level. The other thing that was also very clear, Dr. Shni, to me when you were teaching, is that we are at home right now because of COVID-19. Brothers and sisters are home. There are families that have older siblings, and so it should be easy for parents to task their siblings to help this child who has a disability to be able to accomplish tasks. And if it's participatory and the family is participating, it not only relieves the mother's time so that she can go off, or the father's time so he can go off and do something else, because siblings are helping the young one with tasks. So that was really.
And if I could just say something about that, while we recruit other family members, particularly siblings, I think it's only fair, though, because it is work, that the families consider how to compensate the siblings who are now engaged in teaching. So yes. I don't know. I mean, that was something that was always a discussion here. How do we make it fair? Because those kids, they want to be on YouTube. They want to be on all their social media stuff. They don't want to be required to go teach their younger sibling. So we've always sort of recognized that if they're going to do this, there has to be some compensation. Usually families would pay them.
Yes. I'm sure there can be a trade-off that parents can agree with their teenagers. But I think also, especially if in a lot of our environments in Kenya, we have within even families where the child with a disability is thought to not be able to do anything. So I imagine in this season that if even siblings begin to realize that their brother or sister is capable of something, it opens up their relationship, makes it easier for them to even want to be involved when these kids are adults, because then they understand how I get my brother to participate or do something independently is if I present it in a certain way. So
that's such an important point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So one of the comments we've received is from Felicia, and she says, I've always had an issue with ABA. This session is very informative. So she has no questions. She just needs more listening, to do more listening. However, how does ABA look like for children under 3? What has been your experience, Dr. Shni? And it seems like the suggestion seems to be more geared to school-going kids.
That's a good question. And I should say that I've been working, our center, we were working with youngsters who are starting under 2. So when youngsters were first diagnosed, we were getting diagnoses from developmental pediatricians who were referring to us, youngsters 19 months, 20 months. So this is very much something that there are tools and systems that we can put into place to help very young children learn. So some of the things that children who are very young need to learn are some of the things that I did talk about today. So in order to learn, you have to learn to imitate. In order to learn, you have to learn to pay better attention to the people that are in front of you. In order to learn, you need to be able to do certain things so that we can use those basic abilities as a platform or a vehicle to teach other things. So we would be thinking about the same things, like getting matching in place so that we can teach children to learn to do their activity schedules. I'm sorry, their worksheets. We need matching so that children can do many of the kinds to build it from a block structure. So we need to get the rudiments in place. And that's what we do with all of our very, very young children. We get the rudiments in place. And then from there, we build, we construct more complex abilities. So I hope, if it wasn't clear, these things we would be doing with our youngest children, and using very systematic ways of teaching so that children understand what it is that we're trying to get across. And I want to talk about that in subsequent meetings. What is it that we can do to sort of engage children so that they're happy during learning, they're feeling satisfied, and that they're successful in learning, and that they're learning the rudiments that they'll need, the foundations that they'll need, so that they can learn more complex, more advanced abilities. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes, it does. It
Okay.
does. So I don't know whether our audience has any more questions. If there are any more questions, this is the time to ask before we release Dr. Schnee. So while you were talking, we were running a poll as well and trying to find out whether with our attendees, whether they had heard of applied behavior analysis before this session. And we have, so 80% said yes and 20% said no, they'd never heard of applied behavior analysis before. And then the second question we asked was, how confident are you that you can now work with your child using the insights taught today? And we have 47% saying that they're confident they can use it, and the other 53% saying they definitely need more training. So we do need you to come back.
Yeah, no, I'm delighted to have this opportunity. And again, this is a conversation the three of us have been having. How do we help families get things in place so their children can learn more effectively and efficiently?
Yes.
That's the point of this.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So I don't see any other questions. I guess we start prepping for part 2 of this, which will be same time next week, 5 p.m. Kenyan time. And so we can then do and build on that. And hopefully the parents will already have been practicing what it is that you've taught us today, so that by next week we will have more questions because we've engaged with the lessons that we've learned today.
Perfect. I would love to hear what experiences families had based on what I said today. I hope that what I said people will be able to apply.
Yes.
And I'm just saying that if families feel that they can use this, that assumes that children already have the abilities to do these things, and that's terrific. That's terrific if they already have those abilities and they can use this platform.
Okay. All right. Then. So our gratitude again to Jerry for introducing us to Dr. Schnee. Thank you very much. And thank you so much, Dr. Schnee, for being with us this evening. I look forward to the next session. So let me look for paper and pen and begin practicing. There's still time before dinner to try and see whether my son can do a few tasks. So thank you so much.
My great pleasure. Thank you. Really, it was an honor and a pleasure to be here. And I'll look forward to meeting again. Okay. And to hearing what people have to say and their questions.
All right. Thank you. And good evening, everyone.